Welcome, welcome. So you want to learn what the Dark Elves are in Kingdom Under Fire. Well, this is going to be fun because there's not a lot of information about the Dark Elves. What is known about the Dark Elves is very tied to Valand. Now, if you play the game Kingdom Under Fire War of Heroes, this is where we actually get some juicy details. But overall, they're tied really heavily to Valand, and in later Kingdom Under Fire 2, they have their own kingdom, which, of course, isn't really that amazing compared to Valand. I'm a little biased to Valand. So with that being said, what exactly are the Dark Elves? Some nice little cultural things about the Dark Elves that we do know is that they are a very female-dominated society. Men typically are not warriors. They're not usually in the fighting. They're not usually in any sort of field that requires a lot of vigorous activity. Usually they're more artisans, poets, usually scholars, diplomats even, but they're a little too level-headed, too cool temper, and judging by the way their culture is modeled after an Indian / French / Egyptian type model, there is a possibility that maybe there's even harems of women who are all sharing one man. But the man's not really in the power here. It's actually, he's very dominated by all these women and just gets kind of passed around, and the women fight each other for his time. It's a very unique situation indeed, and for a guy like myself, that just sounds like paradise. Now, within the Dark Elf culture, there is some interesting religious notes that we can take note of. Like, they have a reverence for the moon. They actually love the moon, which is very odd. And the reason why that's so odd is because the elves, the regular elves, the high elves as they call themselves, the regular elves, they worship the sun, they worship the light, they worship what is the god of light, Nibel. Now, they do call him different names like Alona, they call him many different titles, and they do believe in multiple gods even though there's only Nibel and Ankablosa. But it's very interesting to see that where the elves worship the sun and they worship the light because they know that this is where they come from, and they worship the whole area. They worship nature, they worship just the world itself. The Dark Elves, on the other hand, worship the darkness. They worship the moon. They view the moon as a very sacred thing, and whenever one of their beings dies, they usually construct a funeral pyre, which means they burn their dead, which again is very different from regular elves who actually bury their dead. There is some minor religious differences, obviously. Now, this is actually kind of big because the idea of worshiping the moon and worshiping the night, that just seems a little odd, especially because nighttime could be associated with the dark dimension. Now, this turns out not to be the case. They just worship the moon because they admire its purity. It mirrors their skin. Some other differences between the regular elves and the Dark Elves is that the Dark Elves are just highly aggressive. Very aggressive. Now, it's not stated as to why that is, but there is a few suggestions as to why it is they have evolved into this super aggressive species. Some of it is just due to the fact that where Valand is, where the Cadus later become, is in desert regions and also very sparsely populated areas. Now, when you have this desolate locations, usually tribes will fight one another for whatever resources are left available. And it does make a bit of sense, especially when we see in Kingdom Under Fire War of Heroes, it was actually very common for orc raiding parties and dark elf raiding parties into human territories because human territories were the only places that farmland could exist. Now, dark elves would take it a little bit further than the orcs, in that in Kingdom Under Fire Heroes and Kingdom Under Fire Crusaders, the dark elves would still raid humanity despite not needing food anymore, whereas the orcs would actually stop raiding because they had enough food to keep themselves satisfied, to keep themselves alive. The Dark Elves, though, kept raiding, and the answer is kind of interesting. It's like, why are you still raiding humans then? If you now have a nation that has infrastructure, you have a home to go to, you have walls, you have food, why are you still attacking humanity? And the answer is simple. There are riches in the human nation. There is gold, there's gems, there's a lot of shiny materials that are worth a lot. And the elves find it very satisfactory to take it from people, to have someone bleed out in the dirt after they stab them in the gut and then take all their belongings. It's a very unique situation where the elves, they don't really like prolonged warfare. They don't like engagements. They complain all the time about how tired they are, about how their feet are hurting, and how much dirt they have on their skin. But they really enjoy killing people. They really enjoy going in there and taking all your belongings. So it's one of those things where they are made for raiding. They are made to be like this. So it's not about, oh, every Dark Elf is different. No, they're all the same. They're all very warmongering. And we see this in Kingdom Under Fire 2. They're still warmongering, even though they have become mercenaries. Like, the Dark Elves who broke away from Lacatus and broke away from Velond and said, fuck both groups, they're still warmongering, but now they're mercenaries for the humans, for the human nations. They're like, yeah, I just can't wait to get back into this fight. But then they also want their equal time to rest, equal time to recuperate. They just want their gold after they've done a hard day's work killing somebody. It's very unique. So now that we know a bit about their religion, we know a bit about them, how their culture reflects who they are. They're always about raiding people. They're always about raining down arrows on people. They're actually, interestingly enough, able to master horse archery, which no other nation has been able to do. So they're able to ride horses and shoot a bow at the same time. That's legendary. So that inclines us to believe that they must have some sort of steppes, some sort of very desolate area that's just low grasslands and that's it. And the only way for them to survive is by doing these hunting parties where they just gallop away on their horses, shoot down some monster with their bows, and then harvest whatever meat they have taken. Or it could also just be that they conduct their raiding parties really fast. They just swoop in on their horses, rain arrows on the villagers, and then get off their horses and take whatever loot you had. This is really their whole idea, is that the Dark Elves are just warriors. They are just raiders. They like to take from others. Now, there is some interesting stuff, though, about them. Now, we learn in Kingdom Under Fire Crusaders that when Ankablosa comes in and the Age of Darkness takes hold of the world, that the Dark Elves are also being sucked into Ankablosa and killed and turned into Ankablosians along with humanity. Now, this begs the question, why? Why is Ankablosa killing Dark Elves and turning them into Ankablosians? What is wrong with them that they cannot survive in the Age of Darkness? Well, the answer is quite simple, actually. I believe they just aren't. They're not creatures of darkness. They're not tainted. They're not anything abnormal. If anything, there is some evidence that they may actually be cave dwellers. They may even have evolved in darkness. They may have emerged from it. And this is just a more interesting idea of the Dark Elves. Because what we have here is we have a species that is very warmongering, very vicious, and very powerful with magic. But yet, they are not evil. They're not a species of demons. They're not a species that is somehow tainted by the realm of darkness. No, they're actually totally natural. And if they're natural, then that begs the question, how did they get this way? How did they turn dark skin? How did they turn into these warmongering people? How did they turn into these crazy obsessed archers that they are? Well, let's answer that. The answer is quite interesting. There is some evidence that the elves themselves, the regular elves, hate different elves. In other words, if you're a half elf, or if you're an elf who doesn't believe in the same religion that the elves believe, like let's say you're an elf who believes in Ecclesian religion, they will persecute you and chase you out of their fucking area. And this hostility is very unique. This hostility is very odd, especially for beings of light who always preach about peace and embracing the light and embracing the healing. Yet, if you stem any sort of deviation, if you're an elf who per se actually tries to indoctrinate orcs, for example, and try to teach them the ways of the light, the other elves would be like, whoa, you're overstepping your boundaries. We're going to burn your house down and chase you the fuck out of our community. I am not joking. The elves are very, very evil in a certain light. And it's very interesting. Like, we see this with Ellen. Ellen is half elf, half human, and her mother were persecuted in Iran, a kingdom of elves, and their houses were burned down and chased out into Ecclesia. That's how bad it was. So the idea behind the Dark Elves, possibly, is very interesting. Essentially, what could have happened was the Dark Elves are just simply elves who, instead of worship the sun, they should worship the moon. And because they worshiped the moon, they were persecuted and driven out from the forest and into either the steppes or some sort of caves or whatever. And from being in these hostile areas, they changed, they evolved. And this is what led to them being remarkable archers, extremely warlike, and this is what probably led to their downfall, is that the only area around them would be the vampires, also known as Veland. And since Veland is there, they would obviously do what any authoritarian nation would do, which is subjugate a lesser species. And they would do it by engaging the warring tribes of the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves are very fractured. All they need is just a little bit of unification. So, just go to work on them and just do what you'd always do. Take one tribe at a time, and before you know it, you've amassed an army, you've amassed a nation. And this is where Veland probably had its roots and its origins, was in this barren steppe land, bunch of horse archers going around doing their thing, being driven out by the elven society because of their differences. But in that, they grew stronger, they multiplied in huge numbers, and they managed to kick ass with the bow and arrow, they managed to kick ass with spells and magic. And thanks to the leadership of the vampires, they were able to multiply, way outnumber the regular elves. And this is what's led to the Ankablosa issue, where Dark Elves are still beings of light. They're still beings of Berja. They still heal from being around the trees of the world. But despite their appearance, despite the fact that they work with demons, despite the fact that they work with orcs and ogres, they are not loyal to Ankablosa. They don't even care about them. They actually hate them. They try their best to keep the world the way it is. And besides that, this has been Free 700. I am out. Besides that, I hope you guys learned a lot about Dark Elves. See you guys next time.